Hi there, it's Mr. Clark. Welcome to lesson 3.3.2 on diminished intervals. Diminished intervals are the trickiest because they have different rules depending on whether you're in category 1 or category 2. You're going to abbreviate them with a lowercase d, like that. So, category 1, perfect intervals. If you take a perfect interval and shrink it by a half step, you get a diminished interval. That makes sense. Up by one half step, augmented. Down by one half step, diminished. Okay, cool. So perfect fourth, shrink it by half step, C to F flat, you get a diminished fourth. You could also go the other way. This is bringing the top note down to make it smaller. You could also go C sharp to F, raise the bottom note to make it smaller. Perfect fifth to diminished fifth, and this is also a tritone. This is enharmonically equivalent. So tritone refers to either augmented fourth or diminished fifth. Tritone is referring to the sound rather than the notation. So if you want to be precise about how it's notated, you say augmented fourth or diminished fifth. If you're talking about the sound, tritone is fine. Then perfect octave, diminished octave. You'll notice that there's no diminished unison. That's because how do you make an interval smaller that is already the same note? You can't. If you tried to make it smaller, you'd get an interval that is negative 1/2 steps, and since intervals are a measure of distance, you can't have, negative distance. So, no diminished unisons. If you write diminished unison, something has gone terribly wrong. So that's perfect intervals. Now we're talking about major-minor type intervals, category 2. If you shrink a minor interval by a half step, which is equivalent to shrinking a major interval by 2 half steps, or a whole step, you get a diminished interval. So, major, if you shrink it by a half step, you get minor. If you shrink it by another half step, you get diminished. So that's showing the progression here. Major second, minor second, diminished second, which sounds the same as a perfect unison. Major third, minor third, diminished third, etc. And note here, major seventh, minor seventh, diminished seventh. It doesn't necessarily need a double flat just because it's diminished. Depends on what interval you're starting with. Then again, if you, for some reason, have an interval that's doubly diminished, like if I make this even smaller by adding a G sharp, then that would be a doubly diminished seventh. So yeah, there are two ways to think about intervals. And I would recommend using one as your primary method. If you try to use both, you will just confuse yourself. So, method one, which, if you're really comfortable with your major scales, this is a solid method. If you think of the bottom note as scale degree 1 in a major scale, then looking at the top note, if it's a unison, fourth, fifth, or octave, and it's in the major scale, it's perfect, great. And then, if it's off by a number of half steps, you just know this chart. So, C to G flat. If you think about the C major scale, G would be a perfect interval. G flat is a half step lower, so that would be a diminished fifth. So that's how you'd use that chart. Over here, major, augmented, doubly augmented is all the same, but this bottom part of the chart is different. Major, minor is down a half step, diminishes down 2 half steps. So that's why we have separate charts for the two categories. Category 2, again, being second, third, sixth, and sevenths. The other method is counting half steps, and as it's formatted right now, this is awkwardly formatted, where it goes across different pages. Hopefully that will be fixed in the copy that you see. Determine the interval size and number of half steps. This is great if you have a piano keyboard around, or very clearly and correctly memorized, so you can just kind of go like, okay, so that's 5 half steps, and knowing that sort of thing. So I've laid out in the center column, perfect major minor intervals, augmented, doubly augmented, diminished, doubly diminished. So if you have, okay, I have an interval that has 7 half steps, and it's written as a fifth. Well, you look over here, okay, it has to be a perfect fifth. I have an interval that's written with 10 half steps, and it's written as an octave. Well, Oh, it's a doubly diminished octave. So that's how you would use this chart. Um, so as I said, try to use one of these methods as your primary method to get super comfortable with. And if you're comfortable with both, again, still use one as your primary method, but then you can use both interchangeably. If one method is weird for a particular interval, the other one might be easier, etc., etc. But if you try to use them both from the get-go, it's just going to get confusing. So that's what I have for now, and I will see you next time.